So hi, welcome to Many Cultures, One Tradition. This is a program put on by the Jewish Multiracial Network. I will be presenting on their behalf. Just as an FYI before we start, I am not a Jewish professional, so this is not my wheelhouse all the time. I'm actually a public health policy wonk, but this is something that I'm really passionate about, and we'll talk a little bit about why that is and kind of what's up. So just as a heads up, this is, this is on behalf of the Jewish Multiracial Network. If you don't know who we are, so the Jewish Multiracial Network is a brief history. Beginning in the 70s and 80s, there was a network of families who had, for a variety of reasons, either adopted children who were not white or had kind of mixed racial, mixed ethnic marriages, and they were raising children who were not white in Jewish spaces. And they kind of had a different experience than they had originally expected. And out of that came this originally a network of families talking about, like, what are you experiencing, what am I experiencing, et cetera, and kind of formalizing themselves. And in more recent years, our programming has become a little more sophisticated, incorporating not only things about Jewish education for young up to like adult Jews, but also talking about adult Jews of color in communities, in the public eye, et cetera. And kind of our mission is to advance Jewish diversity through empowerment and community building with Jews of color and Jewish multicultural and multiracial families. And our vision is to lead a movement that makes Jewish racial and ethnic diversity fully embraced in American Jewish life. So we're going to talk about history today, but we're also going to talk about our personal communities, our experiences, and the experiences that we, kind of how we impact others' experiences. So as an FYI, what are we doing today? So like I said, we're going to talk briefly about the history of some Jewish communities. We're going to focus on two communities today. We're going to reflect a little bit on what the two communities we're going to talk about today have in common, and then we're going to talk about our experiences in our communities, and we're going to try and bring it all together. So we're going to start with some Jews from India. We're going to focus on two communities today. There's actually different sources give you different counts that range from there's only one Jewish community in India to up to like 6 or 7. I'm going to talk about two, both again for the sake of time, but also because they're two things that I think they hold for me that were valuable in this presentation are, one, they have a significantly longer historical context in South Asia, and we'll talk a little bit about that, and also their practice, in a way to make this most clean, their practice is least influenced, as we understand it, by a direct influence of Ashkenazic Jews, and especially in recent times. So we're going to start with Cochin and then Jews of Kerala, and then we're going to talk a little bit about the B'nai Israel community, which is often also referred to as the Bombay or Mumbai Jewish community. So the Cochin Jews are the oldest community that we have historical proof of in India. So Cochin Jews, aka Kerala Jews, are the oldest one that we have proof of in India. And that history kind of ranges depending on who you're talking to. So the oldest traditions say that they arrive from Judea, directly from Judea, in 562 BCE, and that they were direct exiles from Israel. And there's other stories that say either that small community was added to in 70 CE, so 70 of the Common Era, after the destruction of the Second Temple. Others say that the community actually only starts to originate in 70 CE with the destruction of the Second Temple. There's different stories that kind of range within there of when they started, how they got there, et cetera. And the older population, which would be this population that starts right around either 562 CE, but definitely after the falling of the Second Temple, are known as Malabari Jews. And there's kind of discussion within these communities about the original Jews of the Cochin community, and which aren't. But anyway, so these are the quote-unquote original older population. The community seems to have centered on a city or a trading post or some combination of the two called Kranganor, which would have been north of Cochin, and that they came in as traders or as part of a trade kind of group and settle. And they become a major, not only a major source of trade and interaction with other cultures, but they also become kind of this supported community that as people are traveling through for trade, especially Jews, like they are interacting with the outside Jewish world through that trade. Beyond that, written and oral history is a little complicated. We don't have a long tradition of written down books and histories. We have some examples of letters, which we believe refer to Jews, but it's unclear. Fast forward, and there are pieces called this is the historical proof of the Cochin community, or this is something that they point to. There is a set of copper plates that sit in the Pardesi synagogue in Cochin, which there's mixed reviews on kind of where they come from and what they meant and stuff like that. The plates date themselves to 379 AD or CE, Common Era, but oral history of the community places them closer to 1,000, which is a little bit of a disparity, which is problematic. But basically what they say is they mention that there was a Jewish leader in Cochin named Joseph Rabban, and that he received these plates from the leader of the trade city, which I already mentioned, Kranganor, and it grants the Jews special privileges, which would indicate to anybody who's kind of, from out looking in, that if these plates were received in 1000 in the Common Era, that this was a community that had not only existed, but interacted with leadership and things like that. So we know that they exist. And then there is other proof or suspicion of second waves and third waves of serious immigration. Namely, in the 16th century, we see what we now refer to as Pardesi Jews, which look more South European, that enter the community from everywhere from Constantinople to Iraq, Persia, Yemen, etc. And then finally, under Portuguese colonization, these Jews kind of received, they're protected in a sense, because compared to their neighbors, they follow a religion that is more reminiscent of something that the Portuguese acknowledge. And so in 1663, when the Dutch defeat the Portuguese, they only add to this and give them even more rights, allow them to build synagogues, and you see kind of a stronger community. Now, when India goes independent in the late 40s, when there are these movements, Cochin Jews and the B'nai Israel, who I will talk about later, kind of experience not quite a backlash, but they lose a lot of these special privileges that they had under different external rule. And so today, there's a really tiny Cochin community that still exists, despite this long history, and that's because many have moved either to the state of Israel or throughout Latin America, parts of Europe. But we don't see as much proof, but we know that there's a community that has existed, and when you go to these areas in Israel and the US, and you ask these communities, where are you from? They are passionately, we are Jews from India, we're Jews from Kerala. So, Cochin Jewish practice, really quick, some notes that we do know. They were influenced by the communities that they were in. So there's an emphasis on malchut and kahuna, which kind of refers more to the mysticism around Judaism, and less necessarily straight up Torah, like a lot of us recognize. And there's a variety of reasons that people have conjectured about how that happened, why that happened. It could be a heavy influence of Hinduism and their neighbors. It could be, when you do have less trade and you have less interaction with other Jews, you lose bits of knowledge. And we see that in a lot of these kind of more isolated Jewish communities. When you lose Hebrew and when you lose Hebrew fluency, what happens to your practice? There's also less of an emphasis on kind of the rules as we see them. So things, big ideas like keeping Shabbat stick around and brises, but we kind of lose a sense of what's the halakha around Shabbat? It gets a little complicated. And finally, they have a strong emphasis on women. Cochin Jews have always practiced matrilineal Judaism, but it's suspected that that's less because of the reasons that we rely on, again, as Jews from a rabbinic perspective, and more because they were influenced by the heavy matrilineal leanings of the communities around them that were not Jewish. And And finally, their liturgy is kind of a mishmash of these different immigration routes that we've been talking about. So some of it we might recognize as Sephardi, some of it we might recognize as Yemenite, and some of it we might recognize today as Baghdadi. But even within those spaces of like, we know where this liturgy probably came from, there's actually a whole other set of niganim and tunes that are related to their practice. And again, what of that would have been timely for when they got there, and what of it is just kind of influenced by the isolation and or by their neighbors who are not Jewish. It's hard to kind of draw a defining line. Next up is the Bnei Israel, which I think is probably one of the most interesting communities that still exists, that would still practice, but again, kind of come out of this isolation space. So here are some modern images and some older images. This one is one of my favorites. It's floating around since like the 1900s, 1905. That's a Jewish family, which I love. So the Bnei Israel Jews are the largest Jewish community in India still, and at their kind of height in the late 1800s, were numbering in like, I think it's the like tens of thousands, which would have been larger than all the other Jewish communities in India at the time. So there's varying theories on how the Bnei Israel end up in India. Something that we do know is they are not the Cochin Jews. They'll tell you that, their history tells you that, and their practice is very different from the Cochin Jews. Something that we do know is they have kind of internal stories of where they came from that have tried to be deciphered. The ones that are usually pointed at are, they tell stories of 7 families who came from the north, which leads to kind of a dialogue of by historians that maybe they came from Western Asia, so the root being Israel, and then maybe Persia or Iraq, and then they end up in India. Others say that they're just a lost tribe of Israel. Again, it's a little hard to tell. Much like the Cochin Jews, they generally practice a form of Judaism that wasn't influenced by rabbinic tradition. So rabbinic tradition is kind of where we get these like, what do you do when you don't have a temple type rules? They were following something slightly different. And that, again, gives us a hint of when they started leaving Israel, but not much more. So the oral narrative of their story their general oral narrative talks a lot about outside influence under their community. The earliest one that we have is tales of Rahabi. And it's a strong oral tradition that essentially Rahabi was someone who showed up in India. He may have been a Cochin Jew, he may have not. He may have been an outsider from Europe, he may have not. It's unclear depending on the story that you hear. And essentially interacts with different villages of Bnei Israel peoples and realizes they have vestigial elements of Judaism. Vestigial, if we learn that in science, vestigial limbs are kind of, the limbs that no longer have a purpose in some animals, things like that. So vestigial Judaism, in the case of Indian Jews at the time that he may or may not have found them, which I'll get to in a minute, would indicate things like they get buried differently than their neighbors. Perhaps they don't eat pork and their neighbors do. Perhaps they put an emphasis on something like a bris, etc. These actions that would have been unlike their neighbors. And so he finds them and kind of reteaches them Judaism. And this actually begins a long history of, particularly with the Bnei Israel Jews, a narrative of constantly being, interacting with the outside world, going isolated, interacting with the outside world, getting isolated, and kind of how does that influence practice and how does that influence identity? It's a little complicated. So specifically, Rahabi is a hard one to kind of place because the oral history is, again, a little confusing. It ranges from he showed up in the year 1000 in the Common Era. Other oral histories put him in 1400, but again, the same character, Rahabi. And other people place him as late as the 18th century, so that's the 1700s. So it's hard to place who he is, when he is, what he did, etc. So the Bnei Israel, unlike the Cochin, where the Cochin were kind of a centralized community, they lived in one place, they practiced together, the Bnei Israel functioned in small villages across sections of India. And functioning in small villages also meant that they were heavily isolated from each other. So their practice changes even within their communities. And finally, something that's really important is the Bnei Israel also, like the Cochin Jews, experienced really good favor. They were seen in good light by the Dutch and the Portuguese and the English. And so there's kind of goods and bads that go with that. They receive this positive treatment, but particularly under the English, a lot of their work was in kind of civil positions. And so that kind of got them to move out of their villages and into cities, into larger areas. And so when you already have such an isolated culture that experiences a lot of, shock against its neighbors, and then you pull people out of these small communities, things change when you don't have that home base. So B'nai Israel Jews were often known for being a community that they can't tell you what's in the Siddur, but they can tell you that Rosh Hashanah is a really big deal, and that's kind of been a historic element that goes as long as their history goes. So we see it in modern B'nai Israel, but we also see it in 1700s B'nai Israel. So historically, their practice is influenced by their geography and their history, which is not surprising. The biggest thing being B'nai Israel Jews tend to put the least influence on the concept of the minyan, the concept of meeting as a community. A lot of their prayer and a lot of their practices focus more on the home, whereas a lot of what we as Ashkenazic and or European influenced Jews might focus on a community space, might focus on a synagogue. Along that, there is a limited tradition of scholars and rabbis. Because again, where would you send someone if you don't have that kind of central base of B'nai Israel Jews were focused in this area. And so that influences their modern practice, but also their historic traditions. As I mentioned, their geography and their history means that there's a long history of re-education. And much like the Cochin Jews, where we see elements of different practice, it's actually even more divided and diverse kind of in the B'nai Israel practice, because we see these influences not just at one or 2 points in their history, but throughout their time. So modern B'nai Israel Jews practice anything from something that would be seen as a very traditional biblical Judaism to something that's more recognizable as an Ashkenazic practice. And finally, under British rule, as I mentioned, they move kind of geographically throughout the country, but they also moved towards secularism and more assimilation. And so you'll see that both in practice and just in social settings. The way that B'nai Israel name themselves is slightly different. All right, so we're going to go real quick through the Jews of China, and then we're going to get into the meaty stuff. So again, these images are hard to place because they're in the public record now. They've been in the Jewish encyclopedia since the early 1900s. They're beautiful images. This is a man and his son. This is a family. These are both Jewish families. The Jews of China, aka the Kaifeng Jews, Kaifeng being a region of China, their oral tradition, again, varies like a lot of these disparate communities. Their oral tradition places them in China as early as 220 in the Common Era. The thought is that they were on a trade route, and essentially this would have been a natural progression from Jews in Jerusalem to Jews in Persia to Jews in China. We have the first proof of Jews in China around 70 CE, and in the form of written history, but we have the first kind of outward looking in proof that they definitely existed as a community around 718 in the Common Era, in which a letter from Ibn Zayd al-Hussein al-Siraf refers specifically to a community under a name that's not Jews. It's actually something closer to Zuhus, but he describes practices that would have made them unlike their neighbors. This is something that title, so the fact that it's not clearly something that we recognize as Jews, Yehudit, something like that, places their history in a little bit of a complicated space, because it's hard to name someone a Jew when they don't name themselves a Jew in a way that we recognize. So what does that mean? Throughout 718 and beyond that, we see multiple references to communities named Zuhus. I'm probably saying that incredibly wrong, because Chinese is not any of my languages. And examples that we know that we would recognize as Judaism is these were people who faced west when they prayed. These were people who wore skull caps, which made some people refer to them as, oh, they're the Muslims who wear the skull caps, the different skull caps, or the skull caps that are blue, which we now recognize as not Muslims. Also, we constantly see references to practices of kashrut, or more explicitly as the people who remove the sinew, which would refer to an actual practice of how we as Jews cut our meat, and we don't eat a very, it's the sciatic nerve, I think. And then we even see that reference in Genghis Khan, specifically refers to Jews, or what we think were Jews, at one point in kind of Genghis Khan was all about assimilating into his culture. He specifically references Jews and Muslims, or what we think were Jews, and were definitely Muslims, in saying that he forced them to eat outside of their dietary restrictions. And finally, we see a Ming emperor references a list of names that we believe would have been Jewish names, some of which translate to what we would still recognize as a Jewish name. Specifically, the words for gold and stone are considered Jewish names in China as well as in English. And then the strongest piece of historical evidence that we can find for a Jewish community in Kaifeng are what's called the Kaifeng seals. These are rubbed drawings. There's 3 seals that we've known about for hundreds of years in China. They're dated from 1489, 1512, and 1663. And basically what they do is they discuss not only the traditions of the local Kaifeng Jewry, but they also discuss a history of a synagogue, an expanding community, the hardships that they experienced under different circumstances, a flood, a fire, and then a kind of war-related move that ends in a flood. So it's a community that's experiencing physical hardship in the sense of like they no longer have their space, but then it is further exacerbated by the fact that in 1500, the Ming Dynasty begins to limit travel outside of China. So when you were an isolated community in a physically isolating spot, and now you're no longer able to communicate with your home communities, or at least neighboring communities, to talk about education, to talk about practice, to talk about halakha, to talk about how are you dealing with this challenge. Chinese practice deviates the most from what we might recognize as modern-day rabbinic Judaism. They experience more intermarriage, in part because of where they are, but in part because of traditions in the area around them. Chinese Jews practice patrilineal Judaism, and they start doing that very early on. That is probably one of the strongest kind of deviators from what we would recognize today as like North American and European Jewish practice. And over time, because they lose their access to the outside world, they also lose their Hebrew, they lose their ability to read Torah, and they lose their ability to kind of break apart what are these like modern day challenges we have with Judaism. So that's Chinese Jews. We've talked a little bit about Indian Jews. What do Chinese and Indian Jews have in common? Think about it. They are both Asian. And you're getting on a track, but I want you to pull it even further. So they feel really, I don't know about you guys, but I find generally, when I talk about these Jewish communities, it feels very foreign. That sounds like a silly comment, but it feels very foreign. They don't look like us, or they don't look like us. Their practice deviates significantly from what we recognize today as, modern Jews. I think one of the biggest reasons that it feels so foreign to us is because they're not white. And that's a strong statement that I'm making there, and I acknowledge it's a really strong statement, and I'm down to unpack that if anybody disagrees with that statement as a big one. But I think that the biggest reason that they feel so weird, that we feel so curious when we hear about like Jews in India and Jews in China, is that they don't look white. So if they don't look white, and that feels weird, I push this even further, and I contend that that's because we as Jews in North America and Europe, generally, and I mean this particularly as I'm a Jew from New York, where it feels like the vast majority of the community is Ashkenazic. I think that's because at some point, Jews in America began to see themselves as white. And that's a strong statement, because it deviates from what has generally been our tradition. Jews have been outsiders, and now I think, by and large, particularly in urban settings, we're white people. We pass for people wish us Merry Christmas during the holidays, and nobody really stops us. And even if you're wearing like a Jewish star in most places, nobody really like makes a like, whoa, what is that? Like, what do you do? And I think that that's an incredibly important part of why these communities feel so different. But more importantly, I think that whiteness, if we can all agree to that, influences our practice, how we integrate in communities, how we understand others, and how we interact with new people in our communities or communities that don't look like us. I have very little intent in this presentation of foolishly trying to make the broad sweeping stroke that like, oh, all American Jews, look, act, etc. are the same. That is so not true, and I have no intent of saying that. What I am trying to kind of walk towards is I believe, and my conjecture is, in general, that I think that a strong component of North American, and to an extent European Jews, are Ashkenazic. And the experience of being an Ashkenazic Jew has kind of taken over a lot of our narrative and our monologue and our materials, especially when we talk about a greater Jewish community. That is a broad stroke that I will brush. So I'm not saying that in practice we all look the same, but I think our leadership and our programming and the way that we experience kind of North American, like, larger Jewish life, I think is often painted in a white brushstroke. If you're going to follow me with that walk, though, that like American Jews, in some ways, many of them see themselves as white, then this influences nearly every aspect of the communal Jewish experience, both on an organizational level and on an individual level. There is an immense amount of diversity within Judaism. I'm sure in 2014, we all heard about the Pew study, about the lack of diversity or the increasing diversity, the immense amount of intermarriage, this is an indicator that the Jews are disappearing, this is an indicator that the Jews are getting stronger, etc. Maybe you don't all follow the Jewish blogosphere in the same way that I do. Well, my Jewish world exploded when that Pew study came out. But something that I thought was really interesting that came out of that was all the way at the end of that study, of that survey, they asked some interesting questions. So like I by trade, before I was a health policy wonk, I was a market researcher for pharmaceutical companies. And at the end of every study, we do a really generic set of like, give me some stats on you. What's your race? What's your age? How much do you make? Blah, blah, blah. And that point really gets very little attention in most studies. And the Pew study had a couple of pages on like, how do Jews, like what box in a race and color sense do Jews put themselves in? And how are we not addressing that? And some of it was what we're talking about here. It's this like, okay, a lot of Jews see themselves as white, but there's these huge contingents of like Sephardi Jews that are in this weird place of like, okay, like, I am not white, but I'm also not something else that is in a box here. So do I put myself as white? There's a lot of other. Significantly, black Jews were 2% of the population. That's 1 in 50 people who answered this study were black. More recently, in the New York area, the UJA, less recently, in 2011, the UJA, or the Federation, did a survey, and at the end of it, they added a similar note that while it didn't have numbers, indicated there was a significant racial diversity, and that a large number of biracial, Hispanic, and other non-white Jewish households, particularly pronounced among younger households, should serve as a reality check for those who are accustomed to thinking of all Jews as white. So yeah. So not only were we saying like, hey, like some of us are like Mizrahi, or we're, Sephardi, or we're mixed, or etc. A number of people were just saying, not that either, but I'm also Jewish. How do I fit in here? Like I exist. This is where I kind of fall into this. So I am part of this growing population of mixed Jews. I struggle in Jewish spaces, personally, in part because I think I don't fit a box for a lot of people. Some people will read me as, oh, clearly you're Sephardi or something like that. I get that all the time. But there is a difference in how I interact in Jewish communities than a lot of my peers. And there is a difference for somebody who looks even less white than I do when they enter a Jewish space. And that's very real. And so when I put in this history of like these Asian Jews, it's less because I want to offer you just like done it, boxed it up, that happened too, all of us are the same, blah, blah, blah. That's not it. What I am trying to say is I want to ease us into this conversation about, does mainstream Judaism act like, talk like, interact with the world like it's white? And if so, what does that mean about who we're leaving out? And how can we not leave them out? That's what I want to talk about today. I have to deal with the right now of what it is to be a part of a Jewish community in North America, Europe, or even South America. How do I acknowledge and respect that, and how do we move past that? So I'm actually going to bring this a little bit simpler. Who in this room is a Jew of color, knows a Jew of color, or is even in a community where there is a family or an individual that you believe to be a Jew of color? All right, I see a lot of hands up. Okay. When you first saw that person, what went through your mind? There's no judgment in this room. There's none. Please. You thought he was a convert? Anybody else? Any other thoughts that went through your mind? Please.
Yeah, just similarly, I was wondering if they had one parent that was Jewish and one parent that wasn't.
All right, or maybe they were mixed. They had some like complicated ancestry. I'm gonna put one out there. Did you think to yourself, how'd they get here? Where are they from? That's my personal favorite one. Yeah, I've got some hands up. It's where are they from? How'd they get here? What is that? I get that one all the time when I walk into a room in a Jewish. Oh, I've got a hand up in the back.
Well, Michael Twitty, who's an African American.
Yes, the chef, right? Food writer.
Yeah, brilliant, incredibly brilliant. He said he was in a shul and he was in a courtroom with two Ashkenazi Jewish.
So relevant to this, Michael Twitty is a black food writer and like chef, etc. If you don't know that, he's a large black man. So sorry, you were saying.
He told me like that these two women were like said to each other, "Oh, it's so nice they have somebody that they hired in the courtroom."
Assumption that he is staff or in some way he's not a member of the community. That's another and he was a teacher in the religious school. Do you have another one?
No, it happened to me sitting down at a table at Rommel, and this woman approached us and I was like, so, which one of you is Jewish?
Which one of you is Jewish? Ooh, that's a solid experience. But there's an assumption. You walked into the room and somebody from something that was said or done or how somebody looked, like you don't. One of these is not like the other. And I think that's something really interesting that I again, like there's no judgment in this space. We're just talking about like what really goes through our head. I think there's a really natural response of like, you don't look the way I thought you would. What do I do with that? And I think there's a natural curiosity there. You know, I've personally experienced it. I sort of am on the range of Jewish for some people. Some people think maybe I'm Sephardi, maybe I'm some sort of mix of Mizrahi and something else. I always get this. And there's two interesting reactions that come with that. One is I often experience personally, and I'm sure that other people in this room have either seen it or been a part of it, people not only have that thought, but they approach me immediately and kind of go, where are you from? How'd you get here? And I'm like, okay, I don't know you at all. You're asking some intimate questions. Followed immediately by, it's not just a curiosity. I dare say you're trying to understand me, which is a weird thing to do. And at the end of like, when I've given an answer that feels like sufficient, like when I finally break down, if I feel like it, and go, oh, my mom's from Honduras. My dad is Israeli of Ashkenazic descent. I get responses like, oh, so you're not really Jewish. Cool. Or my personal favorite, immediately followed by another list of questions. Oh, did you convert? I don't know you, ma'am. And I think that it's interesting because we all had a story here. Why do we think it's so weird and curious and strange, and why we don't approach those Jews, or why we think those Jews aren't approached with instead kind of the normal set of questions when you don't know someone in a community? What camp you go to? Oh, where do you normally daven? Oh, you know, like how'd you hear about this? Why do you think that is? You can give it real. There's no judgment in this space. I got a hand up.
Profound lack of manners.
Tell me more. What does that mean?
It means that there's an assumption that if a person
I don't want to get too, it's not a subject I understand deeply, because I don't want to get too deeply into it. But the assumption that you need to treat a person who is relatively similar in a relatively similar in a way that is consistent with your home training, but if they're not, I think there's less. I think it's the wrong side of curiosity. Oh, you're different. That means I don't have to be. That means I don't have to play nice.
Interesting. Okay, so the wrong side of curiosity, that's one.
It's a really unfortunate cocktail of like insecurity as a Jewish community and white supremacy as a white person in the United States, right? So like, I'm a little concerned about outsiders because I'm a Jew and that's a scary thing to be historically.
Yeah.
And I actually have the privilege of asking people who are not white about their business because that's every message from this culture tells me that I have privilege over that person.
Oh, I think you're touching on two really important things there too. There's a little bit of privilege in there, but there's also a little bit of I'm nervous. You don't look like me, and we're like Jews still are. We're different from our neighbors, and we've got a culture and a history that makes us go like, oh, I'm gonna put my walls up a little bit because I don't know you. Okay, that's real. That's real. Anybody else? Any other feelings, opinions, reactions? Yeah.
Just follow up on that. Would the visiting white Ashkenazi Jew to the B'nai Israel community experience the same thing as you say you have experienced sometimes in a white Ashkenazi synagogue in New York?
You know what? I don't know. That's a fair question. That's a very fair question.
Maybe they would, and that's nothing to do with white supremacy there.
Well, I think it does bring up a question though of privilege, because the privilege changes when you're the one different-looking person.
There's a difference. That's all.
Okay.
We are impolitely curious, and instead of thinking, oh, that person looks a bit different, wouldn't it be nice to find out how they came to be with us today, isn't that exciting? We go a little bit different, and then we speak it, and it's just plain rude.
So I like what you're bringing up here, though, because I think sometimes when we bring up something like privilege, or even this concept of like I am the majority in this space, I think there's kind of like if you are in that majority, like it feels a little like like accusatory, and it's not. Like I'm trying to describe a situation and not trying to accuse you of something. So when somebody does this, I don't think they're a bad person. Quite the opposite. I think it's a lot of what we're saying here. Maybe it's a little rude. I'm a little curious. I didn't really, think 3 steps ahead of myself. I just went like, you're different. Whoa. But it's interesting. So like privilege being a thing that exists outside of whiteness, I think that's real. One more comment, and then I'm gonna bring it on to like another. Yeah, we have like 5 more minutes, and I apologize. Please.
Judgmental. And I do think the Jewish people many times are very judgmental on who is really Jewish, who is not. Why is this person here? This is my space. Because I'm Jewish, I don't think this other person has the right to be here. And I think that's something that happens in a lot of communities. We can go from more Orthodox communities where they really try to go back to see where you really came from, to see if you qualify or not to be a part of their communities. And I know a lot of stories from people who were adopted and not considered Jewish, and they had to go through the entire process of converting again. To the time when I was approached, it was a naive approach of, are you Jewish? But at the same time, I'm sure that they wanted to know if
There's like an undertone.
I really should be there or not.
Okay, so it's like a history of like, we've been insular for reasons, many of which are legitimate, and now you don't look like me, and it's a judgment, but it's also like a fear. It's also like okay. So I think there's something that we're hitting on here, and I'm sad we're not gonna have more time to kind of push this conversation into some of the directions that I was hoping to. But I think part of what I do want to take away from what we have said so far as I ask the next question is, if we all acknowledge that by and large in North America, there's a sense of privilege in a lot of these communities, both like specifically within shuls, but also as, like with this bigger brush. If there is this kind of sense of privilege, and it influences the way that we interact with people who don't look like this norm that we've painted in our head, in a general sense, what can we do to kind of combat those responses, combat that misunderstanding, and B, on an institutional level, what can we be doing that acknowledges that there is a difference and that acknowledges that we're maybe not doing the greatest job when somebody who doesn't look like us walks into the room, and that's not okay, and we want to do better. So I challenge you, like, has your community done something that you thought was like really great, or has somebody stepped up and said something when one of these awkward things happen? Like, say it out, because like I think that's a part of what I want to try and get at. Yeah.
I think one thing we can do is look at our publicity materials and websites, and if we have Jews of color in our community, are they represented in the visual representations of our community?
I like that a lot. So looking at our materials, when we market ourselves as a community, do those materials reflect the real community that we experience, or the community that we'd like to welcome? So something that irks me, something that I hear that like makes me like, oh, like when I hear it, in communities, when we say things like our ancestors, our forefathers, and we don't mean necessarily like, oh, you know, like I'm talking about Abraham and Sarah, you know, like when you're talking about like, in Poland, our forefathers, that's not my forefathers. Being cognizant, a lot of this is being cognizant, things like that. So I'm going to open it up. This is a list of things that I was talking about with my friends. So I organize an independent minyan, and these are some of the things that I try to think about. I try to be intentional about. Some really basic ones that we've been talking about are when our materials are white normative, being aware of that and how can we change that, both kind of in our flyers, but even in like the books that we choose to buy for our kids or for our schools. Thinking about our language, again, our forefathers in Poland. Resist the urge to figure someone out who looks different, and instead try to focus on welcoming them and on educating yourself as opposed to requiring them to educate you. And kind of, I encourage you to bring that on to people in your community, to maybe speak up so that that person doesn't always have to. And a lot of what we've been talking about here is assumptions. We don't interact because of assumptions. We don't know how to deal with you because of making assumptions. And I don't know how to teach that to a community, but I do know how to encourage someone to kind of catch that assumption in yourself. Oh, I wonder where that guy is from. You know what? I don't know them, and if they're ready to open up to me, awesome. And you know, I do this all the time too. I see another Latino Jew in an area, and I go, oh, where are you from? Hello, fellow Jew. You know, and kind of accepting that. And I think more than anything, it's a lot about, you know, we've been talking a lot today about kind of education. It's a lot about exposure. You know, this is kind of scratching the surface, and I apologize for all the tech problems today and things like that. But specifically from the Jewish Multiracial Network, I encourage you to check out our website, look at some of our programs, our materials. We have educational materials. We do a conference once every other year, and it's really lovely, and it's a place to actually hash out these things in like a bigger, deeper, like, I know that we touched on a lot of different issues today that I didn't get to talk about, Sephardi Jews and kind of the experience historically and how that's influenced us, and I want to get into that nitty-gritty, and there's no way to do that in like 45 minutes. But I encourage you to check out our website, check out our blogs, things like that. Follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter, and check out our retreat and our nationwide events. We do get into more of this heavy, deep, interesting stuff that's both historical and now, and you know, push this conversation on. We are a part of the Jewish community, and you know, you're a part of our dialogue, and we want to push this and have this conversation. So I really appreciate everybody joining me today. It's 2:54, so there's programs in like 6 minutes, including in this room. So thank you so much for your time and for your patience today, and please, if you have questions, if you think I screwed up today, which I probably did, please let me know, because I want to improve on this. I want to work on this. And if you have anything else you want to talk about, I will be outside. And thank you so much.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS, the Jewish Broadcasting Service, with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the JBS homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to Jem, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.